Alex Trayman, CEO of Jewish News Syndicate. I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt with the Washington Times. It's great to meet with you in your JNS news offices in Jerusalem. So great to have you back on the show.
Well, welcome to Jerusalem. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here. And I am so looking forward to chatting with you because we just had a deep discussion in the lobby here talking about all things Israel and America in terms of the war and politics. And one of the most interesting things is Joe Biden's latest remarks about blaming Israel, in effect, for not taking enough care to protect Palestinian civilians as this war against Hamas goes forward. And your response to that?
Well, I think that Biden is actually playing into the initial strategy of Hamas. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, they sent 3,000 people across the border. They murdered 1,200 people in cold blood. They took over 260 people hostages. And what did they think the response was going to be? They wanted to commit an act so large that Israel and the IDF had no choice but to invade Gaza. Now, did Hamas think that they were going to defeat the IDF, which is one of the most technologically advanced and battle-ready militaries in the world? No, they're just terrorists. Maybe they have 30,000 terrorists with machine guns and maybe some RPGs. They have Qassam rockets, which are essentially pipes that have explosives in them, which they just lob at population centers, but they can't target anything specifically. And they have tunnels underground. This is the extent of the Hamas military capability. So what did they think was going to happen? How did they think they're going to potentially win that war? So they hoped for two things. The first is that if the IDF came into a booby-trapped urban fighting environment, that they could start to murder Israeli soldiers, and that the burden of those losses would be so great that the Israeli people would demand that the IDF stop, and then they would be able to wave the banner of victory. But the second way was that when the IDF would come in, if Hamas was hidden and has hidden all their infrastructure among the civilian population, that there would be no way that Israel would be able to conduct its military operations without killing civilians. And so Hamas was hoping that the death toll of its own civilians in Gaza would go up and up and up to the point where the international community would basically put so much diplomatic pressure on Israel to stop the war. And if even one Hamas leader is holding the Hamas flag and waving it after the IDF retreats, this is how Hamas wins the war. As Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, every civilian casualty in Gaza for Israel is a tragedy. And for Hamas, every civilian that's killed is a strategy.
And it's interesting because what you just outlined is, in effect, taking place on the world stage right now. We hear a lot of talk over in America coming out of the mainstream media and so forth about the poor Palestinian civilians who are being starved to death or they're being unfairly attacked by the IDF. Innocent lives are being lost. But I understand, not just by talking with you, but also by talking with other sources over here, there's a little bit different perspective when you say Palestinian civilians and what that means here in Israel versus around the world. Can you sort of talk about the civilian sector in Gaza?
Yeah, sure. Anthony Blinken, he came here and he said, the Gazan civilians, they're just like you and me. And in Israel, we don't feel like the Gazan citizens are just like us. They're not just like us. And they've been incited from the time that they're children to want to kill Jews, to believe that there's only one state here that's called Palestine. These are not people that want a two-state solution or would even accept a two-state solution. They want there to be no Israel in this area at all. But even in terms of what's happened in recent history, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. And the Gaza Strip was handed over to the Palestinian Authority to govern. Within a year and a half, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority faction, was thrown out of Gaza, with Fatah members killed, thrown off rooftops. And then in 2006 or 2007, there was an election and the Gazan people voted for Hamas. So they voted a terrorist organization to govern the Strip. And if you look at what has taken place just in the last couple of years, what we've learned since the IDF has gone into Gaza on October 7th is that just about every single building that the IDF has gone into in the Gaza Strip, which is tens of thousands of structures. All of them have weapons in them, whether that's machine guns, RPGs, rockets, Qassam rockets, or tunnel shafts inside the buildings. I've spoken to many soldiers, including commanding officers, and they say every single building that they've entered has military infrastructure in it.
And you mean homes as well? When you say buildings.
I'm saying especially homes, yes, but homes and also mosques and also schools. Most of the schools run by UNRWA, which has many Hamas members. UNRWA is the largest employer inside the Gaza Strip, and it's almost synonymous with Hamas. And also, as we're seeing just this week, hospitals are being used as the command and control centers for Hamas. And why? Because all of these structures, mosques, schools, hospitals, they're all supposed to be protected structures. And we saw what happened early on in the war, right? There was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired, right? And yes. But what was the headlines? The headlines was IDF strikes hospital in Gaza, killing 500 people. Now, as it turned out, it wasn't the IDF. It was a misfire Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. It didn't hit the hospital itself. It hit the parking lot outside the hospital, and it did so after midnight, which makes it highly unlikely that 500 people were in the parking lot of the hospital, or even 100, or maybe even dozens. So no part of that story was true. But that's the narrative that Hamas wants to get out. Now, unfortunately, all of the mainstream media ran with those headlines. And we're talking about the New York Times, BBC, CNN, AP, Reuters, all ran within seconds without even checking, to delegitimize Israel. And so, again, like, Israelis don't think that there's innocent civilians in Gaza. They think that the entire population is complicit for what happened.
And it's because, like you said, you see the tunnels under little kids' beds in their own homes.
Right.
So it's very difficult to believe that the civilian population is not aware or even partner with what's taking place with Hamas, correct?
Exactly, yes.
So when people in the West see what Hamas puts out with the images of the poor Palestinian child or the poor family being torn apart because of IDF attack in the area, what are we to take of that? What should be the truthful takeaway from that?
Well, first of all, the pictures are horrible. What nobody likes to see those pictures. Israel doesn't like to see those pictures, but I think that the takeaway has got to be that this is Hamas's fault, that Israel didn't want a war on October 6th. We were just celebrating our festival, and it was a holiday here, and we got attacked on our holiday, but we can't live next to a terror organization that could commit an atrocity like October 7th. There should not have been one October 7th, but there's certainly sure as heck not going to be two October 7ths. And that means that whichever organization could commit that type of atrocity is not going to exist anymore. And Hamas needs to understand that. The Gazan people need to understand it. Hezbollah needs to understand that. And Iran needs to understand that Israel is not going to put up with this. And we're not talking about wars like America fought, against ISIS or Al-Qaeda, 4,000 miles away, 6,000 miles away in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is meters away. Like the Gaza City, you could just walk there. It's not far. We have no choice but to root out this terror organization from our doorstep.
To what extent do you see the Abraham Accords as being sort of the igniter of October 7th?
Well, I think that that's part of it. I don't think that is all of it. I actually think that the Abraham Accords was a response to Iran's nefarious activity and sponsorship of terror all over the region. Iran has destabilized the entire Middle East, including Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Houthis in Yemen were embroiled in war with Saudi Arabia for years until America actually forced Saudi Arabia to stop doing that. They've destabilized Iraq, they've destabilized Syria, they've destabilized Lebanon. And if you want to transform the Middle East, and I think that Netanyahu wants to transform the Middle East and has been working to do that, it's a simple formula. I mean, it's complicated to carry out, but the principles are simple. The first is you root out the terrorism, and the forces of evil in the region, and you normalize relations with the moderates. And we've seen that happen. And the fact that we've seen already 4 normalization agreements, and you had several other normalization agreements, by the way, that were right on the cusp of being signed. I think that had the Trump administration had a second term in office, you probably would have had several other signings of normalization agreements, including probably Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration, they came into office and they immediately slowed down that entire process. Yeah. What did the Abraham Accords do? It was incredible, actually. Aside from basically setting up a sort of defensive posture against Iran, where these nations trusted Israel to be the reliable force that would counter Iran, because nobody could trust America to do that anymore. The opposite, America was funding Iran. But even more than that, what the Abraham Accords did was it took away this veto from the Palestinians on peace in the entire region, right? And if you remember, John Kerry was asked in the final weeks of being Secretary of State in the Obama administration, he said, he was asked point blank, do you ever think that there can be peace with the Arab nations if there's not a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And Kerry famously said his four no's. No, that will never happen. And sure enough, a different administration came in with looking at the region in a different way, and they signed four normalization agreements, one for each one of Kerry's no's. And the Palestinians were looking at what happened, and they said, "Wait a second, maybe we have lost we've lost the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict." And yet the Biden administration was turning around and saying to the Palestinian Authority the same way that they were saying to the Iranian regime. They said, just wait these guys out. We're going to be back. And when we're back, we're going to restore things the way they were previously. And so we were on a good path, to really turning the entire region around. And unfortunately, I think the current administration has not recognized the progress and the potential, and they've clearly steered this region toward violence.
Let's talk about support for Benjamin Netanyahu, because I've been here about a week and I've seen some protests go forth outside of the Knesset. I've seen some signage around Jerusalem, basically critical of Bibi, which I don't know, not being from here, I don't know how much is actual politics stemming from a special group, or how much is widespread. And you were talking a little bit earlier about a sort of deep state type thing taking place in Israel, similar to what's going on in America. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first off, there's definitely big questions as to how an October 7th could happen.
Yes.
And if you look back to when Israel miscalculated in 1973, Golda Meir was the prime minister, Israel was attacked in the Yom Kippur War, they missed all the warnings, and many people died as a result. And, less than a year later, Golda Meir had to step down. She wasn't able to form a government. And so that was like a precedent that's now being waved over here. You failed the people and you need to step down. But people have to recognize, what has been going on in Israel leading up to October 7th. We've had 5 elections in Israel in 5 years, which is something that's not healthy for any democracy. Like, it's good to be able to choose your leaders. It's good to be able to choose your leaders every few years. You don't want to have 5 elections in 5 years. It just creates all kind of toxicity, feeds the media, it polarizes the entire society. And there is a movement in this country that's being led by Ehud Barak, and it was a former prime minister, and others that really want Netanyahu out of office. And they weren't able to convince the voters to vote for somebody else. Netanyahu still retains enormous popularity in this country, even at the same time where he has more people that want him out, but he's still more popular than any other politician. We have a complicated parliamentary system with a lot of parties, so you don't need to get 50% of the vote to become the prime minister. If you get a quarter of the vote, you can, or more, you're probably going to be the prime minister. And going back to these election cycles, we already started to see the beginning of a protest movement. I was telling you before, during COVID, during Corona, we had very strict lockdowns in the country. You could go 500 meters from your house, except if you needed to go to the store to buy food, or the hardware store, or the doctor, or if you wanted to go to an anti-Netanyahu protest, which somehow became like a protected gathering where tens of thousands of people could come. Right. During the pandemic, when you weren't allowed to do other things, you were allowed to go to anti-Netanyahu protests. And in that fourth election, Netanyahu, his Likud party won by 13 seats, more than the second largest party, which is basically like a landslide in an Israeli election. But there was a parliamentary maneuver basically to block Netanyahu from becoming the prime minister. And then Naftali Bennett became the prime minister, who had only 7 seats out of 120, which means that only 95% of the country voted for somebody else. And in order to form a government, they had to take, a few right-wing defectors along with every single left-wing member of parliament and an Arab self-stated anti-Zionist party. They brought them into the government for the first time, breaking like a glass ceiling, which always said you don't form a government with the self-proclaimed anti-Zionist party. Right. They did that in order to create a coalition that was able to push Netanyahu out by a single seat. But what happens? All this anti-Netanyahu movement thinks, okay, ding dong, the witch is dead, right? We got Netanyahu out. And they hoped that he would ride off into the sunset, after a long storied career as the prime minister. But Netanyahu said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm marching into the opposition, and I'm going to be back. And he put a lot of pressure on the government. And within a year, that government fell because the only thing that was gluing that government together was their hatred of Netanyahu. Sure enough, in the fifth election, Netanyahu won a stunning victory with all of his right-wing, loyal coalition partners that stood by him through the entire cycle. Their voters pushed them over the edge, and he was able to form a solid right-wing government. And this sent this whole anti-Netanyahu movement into a frenzy. They couldn't believe it. How could it be? After all these elections, after all this pressure, after finally getting him out of office, after the protests, everything, that now all of a sudden he's back. And not only is he back, but for the first time in his history, he's not governing from the center anymore. He's got a firm right-wing religious coalition. And so all these left-wingers that wanted Netanyahu out, they couldn't control themselves. Now, the first thing Netanyahu wanted to do when they had this right-wing government is to try to curtail the powers of the Supreme Court, which is a left-wing body that is an activist court that selects its own justices. It's a homogeneous body that's not representative of all the society, that's able to overturn legislation, that's able to enforce policies on the government or reverse policies of the government.
Just unilaterally, right?
Completely unilaterally,
okay.
Yeah. And so they wanted to curtail these powers and really just make the court in Israel function much similar to the way the court functions in the United States.
So let me just clarify on the court thing, just so American listeners understand. So the legislative body could actually pass something, and then if these just few members of the court decide they don't like it, they could throw it out. Doesn't matter.
Not only can they throw it out, but they can throw it out. Israel doesn't have a constitution. So in the absence of a constitution, the court says we're the Constitution. And so they can throw out a law on the basis of what they call reasonableness. Like, we don't think that law is reasonable, so we're overturning it, right? It doesn't have to have basis in law. Like in the United States, you can't overturn a law unless it contradicts another law or right that the citizens have, right? So I don't think we should go too far into the whole judicial reforms, right. But in any case, what happened is that this movement that really opposed Netanyahu, they understood that they could rally a lot of support against the judicial reforms. And we started to see mass protests, whatever was the anti-Netanyahu protests before, like on steroids against the judicial reforms. And at certain points, you had even hundreds of thousands of people blocking major highways in Israel, protesting the judicial reforms. But more so, bigger than the protests, they were trying to create a lot of external pressure on the government to retract the judicial reforms. They were basically calling for investors not to invest in the country because of it. They were calling on the credit ratings agencies to reduce Israel's credit rating. Because it's no longer a democratic country if we have judicial reforms. They pushed the labor unions to call a general strike. You saw diplomats, part of the Foreign Service, which are, more to the left side of the spectrum, criticizing their own government. You had a lot of pressure on the U.S. government to put pressure on the Israeli government from the outside. And worse, you had calls, people saying the organizers saying, that Netanyahu is leading the country to bloodshed, that there's going to be violence, there's going to be civil wars, and that they called also on reservists not to show up to duty if they were called, on Air Force pilots that are retired not to come back, like if they had to fight a war, like we're saying now, that they wouldn't show up to fight. So there was an incredible amount of divisiveness here in the country, and it left Israel very, very vulnerable, and it sent a very bad message to Israel's enemies in the region that we were open to an attack.
And it wasn't so much about they weren't protesting so much against the judicial reform, which is certainly sane. It was more to use that message to hit at Benjamin Netanyahu, correct?
Well, certainly. I mean, these things were connected, Okay. So, they didn't want Netanyahu before, and now Netanyahu had like his dream coalition of sorts, and now he was able to pull off an agenda that he was never able to pull off previously. And the left wing in this country, they said the only thing that's been keeping this country from going to the right has been this court. So they knew that they had to protect it, and they really wanted to teach Netanyahu a lesson, which is to say, oh, you think you're the strongest player in the country, you're the government? Well, guess what? If you don't have the military, you don't have the intelligence, you don't have the foreign service, you don't have the labor unions, you don't have the doctors, you don't have the bank, like, you're not that strong, are you? And you don't have the court, of course. So, they used every piece of leverage that they could to destabilize the country. And it was a very bad moment in Israel, and now compounded by October 7th. And you can look back at October 7th and say that divisiveness, led others to think they could attack. Now, something amazing happened on October 7th. You saw the immediate reversal of divisiveness and incredible unity, because that's what happens when enemies of the Jewish people attack. You stop remembering all your divisions, and you realize that the same way that your enemies don't care about your divisions, that you're all basically the same. You have common enemies. And I think that that sense of unity is really rallied around the troops, which, not only did everybody show up for duty when they were called, we had 120% volunteering. When people were getting called up to immediate reserve duty, the people that didn't get called, they were calling their commanders, begging to get in. So everybody understood that they needed to fight, and the country really rallied around the military, rallied around the families of the hostages. But now, about 6 months later, especially after we see all this pressure from the United States on how Israel's conducting the war, you're starting to see a lot of these fissures that were present before October 7th all of a sudden resurfacing.
You told me earlier that the mindset of the Arab world is basically they need clear leadership, and once there's clarity in leadership, they will follow that leader. And in Israel, what you were describing during all this protest movement was a division of Israel. So to what extent do you think that the attacks were tied not just to the Abraham Accords and not just to maybe what's taking place politically in America, turning its back a little bit on Israel, but also to the division that you could see in Israel?
Yeah, I think it's all of it. I mean, I think it's bad American policy, to fund Iran, which has basically sent money, to all these terror organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and others. And it was you're sending signals, that sending signals to Israel's enemies that America did not really support Israel so much, that they were very critical of Israel's government. And certainly the divisiveness was a big factor that sent a strong signal that Israel was vulnerable to attack. In the previous administration, Trump, and a lot of people don't like Trump, but Trump made it very clear that the United States stood with Israel, and that there would be penalties for attacking America's ally. And for 4 years, basically, the Palestinians didn't start up with Israel at all, because they were being penalized for their terror activity, malign activity, and same thing with Iran. And the Biden administration came in and reversed it, and now they're gaslighting our prime minister. All these headlines coming out saying that Netanyahu needs to be replaced. The problem in Israel is Netanyahu and his coalition, that there's right-wing members of the government, as if there's not populists in every single parliament around the world, including in the United States, and you have crazy right-wingers and crazy left-wingers in the Congress and the Senate, and even Donald Trump, by all accounts, was a populist that became the president. So, we have some populists in our parliament. I mean, that's normal, right? But things that are normal, Israel gets accused of. There's always a double standard when it comes to the state of Israel.
So talk about the Joe Biden administration now and the rhetoric that's coming out, the actions they're taking or not taking, and really how that actually affects not just the Israeli people and the civilian force, but how military operations go forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it needs to be made clear, and I don't think that too many people are really they're focusing on this, but the Biden administration has been slowing down this war from the beginning. They didn't want Israel to go in on the ground to begin with, and there were delays before Israel could go in. Israel said, we're going in, we're sorry, we don't care what you say, but they went in. Then the United States said, you have to go out of your way to protect civilians in Gaza. And Israel agreed it was a good strategy. They thought so, but then greater care had to be taken with operations, also to create humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to move from one place to another. If you remember in the original attack on the Al-Shifa hospital, the United States told Israel, you can't go into the hospital. And it took days and days and days before Israel readied the operation, which was then telegraphed and announced to the entire world, where everybody knew that Israel was going into the hospital. And what happens when Israel goes into the hospital? Well, if the enemy knows days in advance that the IDF's going to enter into the Hamas command and control center, what do? They leave before the IDF goes in. And that's why only now did we see, just last week, about 2 months later, after this original incident, that the IDF goes back in by surprise into Al-Shifa hospital and kills over 200 terrorists inside the hospital and arrests thousands of others because this was the military command center of Hamas. So the Biden administration prevented that initial attack, and now they're doing the same thing in Rafah. Now, Rafah is the southernmost city in Gaza, and because the United States told Israel to move civilians out of the way, and this war started in the north, civilians have been pushed down Gaza, and now they're basically living like refugees in a tent city in Rafah. So what we've already learned from hostages who said, we were smuggled down the humanitarian corridors, right? We initially thought that Gaza City was the main stronghold of Hamas, but the terrorists using the tunnels, using the humanitarian corridors, and hostages, the terror leaders, they were all smuggled down into Rafah, where they're now surrounded by close to like 1 million civilians living in tents. And America's saying, you can't go in there. You just can't. They said, you can encircle it. If you have specific intelligence that there's a terror leader in one spot, you can target them. But they also said, we want to set up a joint command and control center, which basically means that the United States would have veto power over any operation that Israel wanted to conduct in Rafah, right? So this operation would have started already a long time ago, except the United States is slowing it down. But time is not on Israel's side, because every minute that this war goes on, every minute that more pictures about what's taking place in Gaza are shown to the international community, every minute that the United Nations has to deliberate over whether or not this war is just or whether Israel's committing some kind of a genocide, which is ironic because there's probably more people alive in Gaza in 2024 than there were in April of 2023, just in terms of the overall numbers, even after the war. So in terms of genocide, Israel's probably the biggest failure in the history of genocidal maniacs in accomplishing their genocide. But of course, Israel gets accused of that. So time is not on Israel's side, and the Biden administration, they understand that, and they're trying to slow this down.
So what would happen if Israel just said, forget it, we're just going to do what we want, America be danged, the rest of the world be danged? How would you see that playing out?
Well, Israel's basically said that. I mean, Antony Blinken was here less than 2 weeks ago, and from my sources in the Prime Minister's office, they told Blinken explicitly, we are going to go into Rafah. We don't care about your objections. We saw that that a delegation of Ron Dermer, who's the Minister of Strategic Affairs, and Tzachi Negbi, who's the National Security Advisor, they were supposed to go to Washington to hear America's objections, and Netanyahu pulled back on that delegation and held it here. Why did he do that? Because the United States did not use their veto in the UN Security Council, in a resolution that was calling for an immediate ceasefire. Minister Dermer, I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago. He told me, he said, even before this resolution, he said, even if some resolution gets passed, in the United Nations calling for an immediate halt to the hostilities, even if the United States stops providing weapons, which they're committed to do, to Israel, he said that Israel's going to fight with its fingernails if that's what it has to do, and that they are going to go into Rafah. But Israel has basically pivoted to use some of this time to go back and clean up in other areas of the Gaza Strip, because it's very dynamic, and the IDF comes through an area, they clear it out, but Hamas then goes back and tries to resettle in some of those areas. So the IDF's been kind of cleaning up some of these areas, which is why they went into that Al-Shifa hospital the second time, so they're using this time before the Rafah operation both to figure out where and how they're going to actually move civilians, and they are. They're putting in place plans to move civilians north of Rafah and to build other tent cities. By the way, Israel's going to be setting up that infrastructure. Israel's going to be paying for the tents. Israel's paying a lot of money for all this humanitarian aid that goes into Gaza. People don't realize that it's costing Israel billions and billions and billions of dollars providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians that taxpayers are going to be paying for. I think you will see within a matter of weeks that Israel's going to go into Rafah.
So does Israel have enough military capabilities to take on Hamas and Hezbollah at the same time successfully, even if they were, especially if they end up going it alone?
Sure. I think Israel's made it clear that they don't want to fight two fronts simultaneously. That's because there's a limited number of soldiers, there's a limited number of tanks, and there's limited amounts of air power. If Israel had no choice, Israel would do what it needs to do. But if there is a choice, Israel prefers to fight a single front at a time. And when it comes to some of the more advanced weaponry and the artillery and the missiles that Israel has, you actually see that Israel's husbanding some of this its stock, in understanding that they might have to use it in the north. Which is a much more volatile situation, a much more dangerous situation than Hamas. And that's why you've seen in multiple incidents where Israel has lost numerous soldiers who are basically detonating structures by going inside the buildings and planting explosives instead of just bombing these things from the air, which would be much simpler because they're trying to save their stocks in case they need to use it in Lebanon.
Which you just brought up a topic I just wanted to finish on this particular issue. We were talking about the injured Israelis, which is something that we're not hearing about in the West. We're hearing about the poor Palestinian children who are starving to death, supposedly. But you mentioned that there are thousands, and in Israel, everybody knows everybody. So it's not removed like in America where they're faceless names and so forth. So just talk about in your own office here at JNS, the people that you know who have been victimized, and then broaden that about how many in terms of soldiers. In the IDF.
I think it's a very important point. Like the IDF is a citizens army, and what that means is that every single soldier is somebody's son, brother, husband, coworker, or friend. And there's not one person in this country that doesn't know people that were killed on October 7th or people that were taken hostage on October 7th. And if you don't know somebody directly, you know multiple people by only a single degree of separation. And, at this current moment, I know multiple soldiers that are inside Gaza who have been called up in other areas. And yes, we hear about the death tolls. We know that 1,200 people were killed on October 7th. There were thousands of people injured on October 7th, and we hear about the 250 or so soldiers that have been killed. since the war started. There have been thousands of soldiers that have been injured. And when we talk about injuries, we're not talking about sprained ankles, okay? We're talking about people that have been hit with shrapnel, people that have been shot, people that, sometimes we hear things like moderately injured, right? So you think, okay, moderately injured, that's not so bad, right? A moderate injury means somebody lost a limb, but the prognosis for continuing to live is good, so even just like we were talking about here, even in this office, you met our head of finance and operations over here. He had 2 sons in the Army at one time, and one of his sons was in the combat engineering. These are the groups that go into the buildings and detonate them. They just go into Gaza and they blow stuff up. And his son, who was in Gaza, lost many friends, and like just in the next building or whatever it is, and they've been to a lot of funerals. We had our webmaster's son was in Gaza, was hit by shrapnel, was also in combat engineering when RPG hit a tank, was hit by shrapnel, had shrapnel removed from 6 places in his body, from his knee, from his arm. He has some nerve damage in his arm. He had to have a section of his colon removed because it had been pierced by shrapnel. But this was probably a light to moderate injury, because after several surgeries to remove all the shrapnel, and get a nerve graft, his prognosis for a healthy life is good. And we have, our designer here, a creative designer, graphic artist, her brother-in-law was in a tank that was hit by an RPG, and there was smoke in the tank, and his lungs got destroyed, among several other burns and other injuries, and he's basically been in an induced coma for 2 months and is waiting a lung transplant. So this is life, and it's amazing that Israelis kind of go on with their life as normal. You probably felt that,
yes,
because we're very resilient. But this war touches a nerve for every single member of this society, every single citizen in this country.
Alex Trayman with JNS, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Cheryl.